I remember that morning like it never ended, like it is still trapped somewhere inside my head, repeating itself over and over again without mercy, without silence, without forgiveness. It was Easter Sunday, a day that was supposed to mean rebirth, forgiveness, family. But inside me there was nothing left that could be reborn, nothing left to forgive. I had already been dead long before that day arrived. I just did not know it yet. There were 11 of them in that house, 11 voices, 11 lives moving around me, laughing, talking, existing as if everything was normal, as if I was normal. But I was not. I had been watching them for years, feeling smaller every day, feeling like I did not belong in my own life, like I was just a shadow walking between walls that were never mine. My mother, my brother, his wife, the children. They filled the space with noise and expectation, and I felt like I was suffocating inside. Something I could not escape. People think things like this happen suddenly, like a switch flips, like madness appears in a single moment, but that is not true. It builds slowly, silently, like pressure under the surface, like something rotting deep inside. Every word, every look, every moment where I felt judged, ignored, controlled, it all stayed there, stacking, growing, becoming heavier until it turned into something else, something darker, something irreversible. That morning there was nothing special on the outside, the same house, the same voices, the same routine, but inside me something had already crossed a line, something had already decided that there was no way back. I moved through the house like I was already disconnected from everything, like I was watching myself from somewhere far away, like I was no longer part of what was about to happen. I remember the weapons. I remember the weight of them in my hands, cold, real, final. They were not just objects anymore, they were answers. Or at least that is what I convinced myself of. I told myself that this was the only way to end it, the only way to silence everything, the only way to take control of a life that had never felt like mine. The first moment is the one that never leaves, the first sound, the first realization that there is no turning back, that everything after that point is already decided. I can still hear it, still feel it, like it echoes somewhere deep inside me. And after that, everything becomes blurred, not because I forgot, but because it happened too fast and too clearly at the same time, like a nightmare that refuses to fade. They did not understand, none of them did. There was confusion, fear, movement, voices turning into screams. And I kept going, step by step, room by room, like I was following something already written, something inevitable, something that had been waiting for this exact moment. I was not thinking anymore, not the way people think. It was something else, something colder, something empty. Children were there, and even now that word feels heavy, impossible. But in that moment nothing stopped me, nothing broke through whatever had taken over. Everything that should have mattered did not matter anymore. Everything that should have stopped me was already gone, buried under years of silence and resentment and something I could never explain even if I tried. When it was over, there was no relief, no sense of victory, no clarity, just silence, a silence so heavy it felt louder than everything that had happened before. The house was no longer filled with voices, only with what was left behind, and I stood there in it, surrounded by the result of something I could not undo, something that could never be undone. People ask why, they always ask why, as if there is a reason that could ever make sense of something like this, as if there is a sentence that could explain 11 lives ending in a single day. I told them things. I said I felt controlled. I said I felt trapped. I said I believed they were against me. But the truth is deeper than that, darker than that. Because even I do not fully understand how a mind reaches that point, how it crosses that invisible line and never comes back. I called the police myself, my voice calm, almost detached, as if I was reporting something that had nothing to do with me. I said there had been a shooting, simple words, empty words, as if what happened could be reduced to something so small, so ordinary. But there is nothing ordinary about that day, nothing that can ever be made normal again. They came, they saw, they tried to understand, just like everyone else who would later hear about it, read about it, talk about it. But understanding is something that does not exist here, not really. Because what happened that Easter Sunday is not just an event, it is something that breaks logic, something that lives outside of explanation. Now all that remains is time, time to think, time to remember, time that does not heal anything, time that only repeats the same images, the same sounds, the same moments that led to everything ending. I am still here, but everything that made life what it was ended that day, not just for them, but for me too. Even if my body continued, even if my voice still speaks, even if my mind keeps trying to go back and find the exact moment where it all could have stopped, where something could have been different. But there is no different version of that day, no alternate ending, no second chance. There is only what happened, and what happened will never leave. It will always be there, like a shadow that does not disappear, like a memory that refuses to fade, like a truth that cannot be changed, no matter how many times it is told, no matter how many times it is remembered, no matter how many years pass, it remains exactly the same, frozen in that morning, in that house, in that moment where everything ended and nothing could ever begin again. And the strange thing is that people imagine a breaking point as something loud, something explosive, but for me it felt almost quiet, like a decision that had already been made long before I was aware of it, like I was simply arriving at something inevitable, something that had been forming in silence for years, every day adding another layer, another weight, another reason that I never spoke out loud. Because how do you explain a feeling that does not have a clear shape? How do you describe something that grows inside you without words, without logic, without limits? I had lived in that house not as a person but as something that existed between expectations and failure, always measured, always compared, always seen through someone else's eyes. And maybe that is where it started, not with anger, not with hatred, but with a slow erosion of self, a quiet disappearance of identity, until there was almost nothing left that felt like me, only a reflection shaped by judgment, by pressure, by a constant sense that I was never enough, never right, never free. That morning was not different in what happened around me, but it was completely different in what happened inside me. Something had finally aligned, something had finally said that this was the moment, not because of what they were doing, but because of what I had become, or maybe what I had stopped being, because by then I was no longer reacting to life, I was ending it, not just theirs, but mine in a way that no one could ever reverse. I can still remember walking through the rooms afterward, not as someone who had done something, but as someone observing the aftermath of something already finished, as if I had stepped outside myself and was looking at a scene that no longer involved me. And that is the part no one talks about, the emptiness after everything, the absence of emotion where there should be something overwhelming, the silence that replaces everything. A silence that feels unnatural, heavy, absolute. There is a moment when reality returns, not suddenly, but slowly, like a shadow creeping back in, and with it comes awareness, not regret at first, not guilt, but awareness that something irreversible has happened, that time cannot move backward, that nothing can be undone, and that realization is not loud, it does not scream, it settles, it stays, it becomes permanent. People want monsters to look different, to sound different, to be obvious, but the truth is more disturbing than that, because nothing about me before that day would have prepared them for what happened. I was not someone they would have feared, not someone they would have pointed at, and maybe that is what makes it worse, because it means that the line between what is normal and what is not is thinner than anyone wants to believe. I have gone over it again and again, every step, every movement, every second, trying to find the moment where it could have stopped, where something inside me could have changed direction. But the truth is that by the time that day arrived, there was no stopping point left, only a continuation of something that had already taken control long before any action was visible. When I spoke to them afterward, when I gave explanations, when I tried to put into words what had no clear structure, I realized that language fails in moments like this, because there is no sentence that can carry the weight of what happened, no explanation that can make it understandable, only fragments, only attempts, only incomplete thoughts that circle around something too complex, too dark, too absolute. There is a kind of isolation that comes after everything, not just physical, but internal, a separation from everything that once felt familiar, because once you cross a line like that, you do not return to who you were, you do not rebuild, you do not continue, you exist in a space defined entirely by that single day, that single sequence of events that erased everything else. Time continues, but it does not move forward in the way people imagine. It loops, it repeats, it brings back the same images, the same sounds, the same realization that nothing can be changed, and in that repetition there is no escape, only permanence, only the understanding that some actions do not belong to the past, they remain present forever, unchanged, untouched by time. And maybe that is the most difficult truth of all. Not what happened, not even why it happened, but the fact that it cannot be separated from me, it cannot be placed somewhere else, it cannot be distanced or softened, it exists as a constant, as something that defines everything that came after, something that cannot be undone, cannot be erased, cannot be rewritten. If there is anything left to say, it is not a justification, not an excuse, not an attempt to make sense of something that does not allow itself to be understood. It is only this, that what happened did not begin on that Easter Sunday, it only ended there, because the beginning was invisible, silent, unnoticed, and by the time it reached the surface, it was already too late for anything to stop it, too late for anything to change, too late for anything except what happened. And that is what remains, not just the memory of that day, but the knowledge that once a line like that is crossed, there is no return, no redemption in the way people imagine, no closure that makes it complete, only the continuation of something that ended everything else, leaving behind a silence that never truly fades, no matter how much time passes, no matter how many words are spoken, no matter how many times the story is told, it stays the same, unchanged, absolute, final. There are moments when I try to remember what it felt like to be normal, to wake up without that weight pressing against my chest, to exist without constantly measuring every thought, every glance, every word that passed between us. But those memories feel distant now, like something that belonged to another person, someone I can no longer fully recognize, someone who slowly disappeared without anyone noticing, including myself. It is strange how the mind protects itself, how it rearranges events, how it builds its own version of reality just to survive what it cannot fully face. Because if everything was seen clearly all at once, if every detail carried its full meaning at the same time, it would be unbearable, impossible to exist with. So instead it fragments, it softens, it distances, not to excuse, but simply to allow continued existence inside something that should not be survivable. I remember the small things more than anything else, not the obvious, not the moments people would expect, but the details that should have meant nothing, the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the way light entered the room through the window, the quiet conversations that once felt ordinary, all of it now carries a different weight, a different meaning, as if everything was leading to something that no one could see at the time. If you ask when it truly began, I cannot give you a single moment, because it was not a moment, it was a process, slow and invisible, like something growing beneath the surface, unnoticed until it breaks through, and by then it is already too large, too developed, too powerful to be stopped, and that is the part that is hardest to explain, because people want beginnings they can point to, causes they can understand, but not everything begins in a way that can be clearly defined. There were thoughts I ignored, feelings I buried, instincts I refused to acknowledge, not because I understood them, but because I did not want to. because facing them would have meant admitting something was wrong, something deeper than what could be fixed, and denial has a way of extending itself, of delaying the inevitable until it becomes unavoidable. After everything, there is no future in the way people imagine it, no rebuilding, no new direction, only continuation inside a fixed reality, one that does not change, one that does not allow distance from what happened, because no matter where I am, no matter how much time passes, that they exist in the same form, untouched, unchanged, present. People speak about regret as if it is a single feeling, something clear and direct, but it is not like that. It is layered, complex, sometimes distant, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes replaced by something else entirely. Because the mind does not process something like this in a simple way, it moves through different states, different levels of awareness, different degrees of acceptance, none of them complete, none of them final. There are times when I try to understand it as if I were someone else, as if I were looking at this from the outside, trying to analyze it, trying to break it down into reasons and patterns and explanations. But even then it does not fully make sense, because logic fails when it reaches something like this. It can describe parts of it, but it cannot contain it entirely. The silence remains the most constant thing, not just the absence of sound, but the absence of what once filled that space, the absence of movement, of voices, of life, and that absence becomes something of its own, something that stays, something that cannot be replaced. Because once it is created, it does not disappear. I have thought about what people expect to hear, what they want from a confession, whether they are searching for remorse, for explanation, for something that gives structure to something that feels chaotic and incomprehensible. But the truth is that no confession can fully satisfy that need, because what happened does not fit into something clean, something understandable, something that can be resolved through words. What remains is not just the event itself, but the awareness of it, the constant presence of it, the understanding that it cannot be separated from me, that it exists as part of everything that follows, shaping every thought, every memory, every attempt to move forward, even when moving forward does not truly exist in the way people think it does. And maybe the hardest part is not the memory, not even the permanence of it, but the realization that nothing can be exchanged for it, nothing can be done to balance it, nothing can be said or felt that changes its weight. It remains exactly what it is, complete, irreversible, beyond adjustment, beyond correction. If there is anything left, it is only the continuation of time, the passing of days that do not remove anything, that do not lessen anything, that only add distance without removing presence. Because distance and presence are not the same, and even as one increases, the other remains unchanged. So the story does not end, not in the way stories are supposed to end. There is no conclusion that resolves anything, no final point that brings closure, only continuation, only existence inside something that has already defined everything that follows, something that cannot be rewritten, cannot be softened, cannot be undone, remaining exactly as it was in that moment, on that day, when everything stopped and nothing could ever truly begin again. There is a point where memory stops feeling like something that happened and starts feeling like something that is still happening, as if time folded in on itself and trapped that day in a loop that never truly releases me. Because no matter how far I move from it in years, I never move away from it in thought. It remains close, immediate, unchanged, as if it exists outside of time, fixed in a way that nothing else in life ever is. I have tried to understand whether it was something inside me that was always there or something that formed over time, something created slowly through years of pressure and silence. And I still do not have an answer that feels complete, because both possibilities lead to the same place, to the same reality that cannot be altered, cannot be questioned into something different, cannot be undone by understanding alone. There were chances, moments that now seem like they could have been different, conversations that could have gone another way, thoughts that could have been acknowledged instead of ignored, But those possibilities only exist now, after everything. They did not exist in the same way then, or at least I did not see them, and that is what makes reflection so difficult, because it creates versions of reality that were never actually present at the time. What people often misunderstand is that nothing about that day felt dramatic in the way they imagine. There was no clear transformation, no visible shift from one state to another. It was quiet, controlled, almost methodical, and that is what makes it harder to comprehend, because it removes the idea of chaos and replaces it with something far more unsettling, something deliberate, something that cannot be dismissed as a moment of confusion or loss of control. Even now, when I revisit it in my mind, I do not see it as a sequence of actions as much as a single continuous movement, something that started and did not stop until everything was already finished, and within that movement there was no pause long enough to allow doubt to take hold, no interruption strong enough to break what had already begun. The idea of stopping feels distant when I think about it now, not because it was impossible in a physical sense, but because mentally there was no space left for it, no room for hesitation, no place where another decision could have entered, and that absence of interruption is something I still cannot fully explain, because it suggests a level of certainty that does not feel human, does not feel natural, and yet it was there. There is also the question of identity, of who I was before and who I became after, but even that distinction feels incomplete, because the separation is not clean. It is not as simple as before and after. It is more like a merging, where everything that came before is absorbed into that one event, redefined by it, altered in a way that cannot be reversed, so that even the past no longer feels separate from what happened. I have realized that people search for meaning in events like this because meaning creates distance, it creates structure. It gives them something to hold on to, something that allows them to believe it could be understood, predicted, prevented. But not everything offers meaning in a way that can be accepted. Some things exist without offering that kind of clarity, without fitting into a framework that feels safe or complete. There is also a kind of permanence that goes beyond memory, something that settles deeper than thought, something that becomes part of how the world is perceived afterward. Because once something like that happens, it changes not only the past, but also how everything else is seen, how every moment is interpreted, how every silence is felt. I sometimes think about the idea of forgiveness, not in a religious sense, not in a way that suggests resolution, but as a concept people rely on to bring closure to something that feels open, unfinished. But forgiveness does not change what exists. It does not alter the reality of what happened, it only changes how it is held, and even that change does not erase anything, it does not remove the permanence, it does not rewrite the event. There are no words that can fully carry the weight of that day, no narrative that can contain all of its layers, because what happened is not just an action, it is a collapse of everything that should have prevented it, everything that should have interrupted it, everything that should have made it impossible, and that collapse is something that cannot be easily explained or reduced to a single cause. What remains is a kind of stillness that follows everything, a stillness that does not bring peace, but rather the absence of movement, the absence of change, a fixed state that continues without variation, without progression, without resolution, because resolution would require something to be undone, and nothing here can be undone. And so it continues, not as a story that moves toward an ending, but as something that has already ended and simply remains, existing in the same form, in the same structure, in the same unchangeable state, no matter how much time passes, no matter how many times it is remembered, no matter how many attempts are made to understand it, it stays exactly as it was, final, complete, and beyond anything that could ever alter it. It is impossible to separate that day from what it was supposed to represent, because Easter is not just a date, it is an idea, a symbol people hold on to, a belief in renewal, in forgiveness, in the possibility that something broken can be restored, and maybe that is what makes it all feel even more distorted, because while the world outside was preparing for resurrection, inside that house everything moved in the opposite direction, toward an ending that had no return. I remember hearing fragments of conversations about church, about meals, about traditions that had repeated every year, words about faith, about grace, about second chances, and it all felt distant to me, not because I did not understand it, but because I could no longer connect to it, as if whatever part of me once believed in those ideas had already disappeared long before that morning arrived. Easter is meant to remind people that even after suffering, even after death, there is something beyond it, something that rises again, something that continues. But what happened that day does not fit into that structure. It does not lead into renewal. It does not transform into something hopeful. It stops completely, leaving behind only what cannot be reversed, what cannot be given another meaning no matter how much time passes. There is a contradiction in that, something that cannot be resolved, because while the meaning of Easter speaks about life returning, what happened inside that house erased it, and the two realities cannot coexist in a way that makes sense. They stand against each other, one representing belief, the other representing its complete absence, and I existed between those two without truly belonging to either. People gathered that day expecting something familiar, something comforting, something that had always been part of their lives. But what they found instead was something that broke that expectation entirely, something that replaced tradition with something final, something that cannot be integrated into the meaning of the day no matter how it is remembered or described. Even now, when I think about Easter, it does not bring images of celebration or faith. It brings back that same stillness, that same silence that followed everything, because the day itself became tied to that moment, redefined by it, changed in a way that cannot be undone, so that what it once represented no longer exists in the same way, at least not for me. There is also something else, something people do not often speak about, the idea that timing matters, that certain days carry meaning beyond themselves, and when something like that happens on a day already filled with symbolism, it does not remain just an event, it becomes something that distorts that meaning, something that alters how that day is perceived, remembered, understood. I have thought about whether it would feel different if it had happened on another day, whether the weight would be the same, whether the memory would carry the same contradiction, and I cannot answer that, because it did not happen on another day, it happened on Easter, and that connection cannot be removed, cannot be separated, cannot be replaced with something neutral. There were moments before everything began where I was aware of the day itself, aware of what it meant, aware of what it represented to others, and yet that awareness did not change anything. It did not interrupt what was already forming. It did not create hesitation strong enough to stop what had already begun inside me, and that is something I still cannot fully understand. How something so widely associated with life and renewal could exist at the same time as something moving toward its complete opposite. Faith, tradition, family, all of these things are tied to Easter. All of them were present in that house in some form, and yet none of them held enough weight to counter what was happening internally. None of them were enough to break through what had already taken hold. And that absence of interruption remains one of the most difficult parts to comprehend. There is a tendency to look at events like this and try to assign them meaning, to connect them to something larger, to see them as part of a pattern or a lesson. But not everything fits into that kind of structure. Some things resist it entirely. Some things remain separate from the ideas people use to understand the world, and this is one of them. What remains connected to Easter is not its message, not its meaning, but its timing, the fact that both existed at once, the belief in renewal and the reality of something that ended everything. And that contrast does not resolve, it does not soften, it remains as it was, sharp, clear, impossible to merge into something unified. And so the day continues to exist in two forms, one that the world recognizes, one that people return to every year with the same beliefs, the same traditions, the same sense of hope, and another that exists only in memory, fixed, unchanging, carrying a different meaning entirely, one that does not align with the first, one that cannot be reconciled with it, one that remains separate no matter how much time passes. There is no resolution between those two versions, no point where they meet and become one, only coexistence, only the awareness that both are real in their own way, both exist in the same moment, on the same day, and yet they do not belong together, they do not create a complete picture, they remain divided, just as everything that happened that day remains divided from what it was supposed to represent. And that division is what stays, not just as a memory, but as a constant presence, a reminder that even on a day built around the idea of life returning, there are moments where nothing returns, where everything ends in a way that cannot be reversed, cannot be reinterpreted, cannot be transformed into something else, remaining exactly as it was, final, absolute, and forever tied to that morning when the meaning of Easter and the reality of what happened could never become the same. There is something unsettling about how traditions continue no matter what happens within them, how the world moves forward with its rituals, its symbols, its quiet certainty that meaning remains intact, even when somewhere within that same moment something completely opposite unfolds, something that does not belong to that meaning at all, and yet exists inside it without being acknowledged by it. Outside, Easter remained what it had always been. People gathered, churches filled, candles burned, voices spoke of sacrifice and renewal, of darkness followed by light, and everything followed the same order it always had, unchanged, uninterrupted, as if nothing else existed beyond that shared belief, as if nothing had happened that could ever alter it. But inside that house, the idea of renewal never arrived. There was no transition from darkness to light, no movement toward something better, only an ending that stayed where it was, fixed, complete, without continuation in the way people expect, without transformation into something meaningful or redeemable. It creates a kind of separation between what people believe and what can actually happen, a distance between the symbolic and the real, because symbols suggest order, purpose, structure, while reality does not always follow those rules. Sometimes it breaks them completely, leaving behind something that does not fit into any pattern, something that exists outside of the expectations people build around certain days, certain meanings, certain beliefs. I have thought about whether meaning itself changes after something like that, whether a day like Easter can ever remain the same once it has been connected to something that contradicts everything it represents. But the answer seems to be that meaning continues for those who were not there, for those who did not see what happened, for those who can still return to it without that memory attached, while for others it becomes something else entirely, something altered, something that can no longer exist in its original form. There is also the idea of resurrection, of something rising again after it has ended, and that idea stands in direct contrast to what took place, because nothing that ended that day returns, nothing rises again in the way the day suggests, nothing is restored to what it was before, and that absence creates a silence that cannot be filled by belief alone, because belief requires something to connect to, something to rebuild from, and here there is only finality. Even the concept of forgiveness, so closely tied to the meaning of Easter, becomes difficult to place within something like this, because forgiveness implies a movement forward, a release, a transformation of how something is held, but what happened resists that movement. It remains fixed, unchanged, not because forgiveness cannot exist, but because it does not alter the structure of what occurred. It does not reshape it into something different, it only exists alongside it without replacing it. There were moments before everything began where the ordinary details of that day were still present, the preparation, the expectation of a shared meal, the quiet familiarity of a tradition that had repeated itself many times before, and those moments now feel almost distant, almost unreal, as if they belonged to a different version of that day, one that never fully came into existence, one that was interrupted before it could become what it was meant to be. It is difficult to explain how quickly something can shift from one state to another without any visible warning, how a day that begins with meaning and structure can move into something entirely different without any clear transition, without any signal strong enough to indicate that everything is about to change in a way that cannot be reversed. And that is what remains, not just the event itself, but the awareness that it existed within something larger, within a day already filled with meaning, and that contrast does not resolve over time, it does not become easier to place, it does not settle into something understandable, it stays as it was, divided, separate, impossible to merge into a single narrative that feels complete. The world continues to return to Easter every year, repeating the same rituals, the same words, the same beliefs, and for most people those meanings remain unchanged. They continue to represent hope, renewal, continuation. But there are moments, events, realities that exist alongside those meanings without belonging to them, without being absorbed into them, remaining separate, untouched by the interpretations people rely on. And so there are two versions of that day that continue to exist, one that belongs to everyone, that returns every year in the same form, carrying the same message, and another that exists only as a fixed memory, one that does not repeat, does not change, does not evolve, remaining exactly as it was, unaffected by time, unaffected by belief, unaffected by the meanings people assign to the day itself. There is no point where those two versions meet, no place where they become one, only the understanding that both exist at the same time, on the same day, carrying completely different realities, completely different meanings, completely different outcomes, and that separation remains permanent, just as everything that happened that day remains permanent, unchanged, final. And maybe that is the closest thing to an ending that can exist here, not a resolution, not a transformation, but simply the continuation of that separation, the coexistence of meaning and its absence, of belief and its contradiction, of a day that promises life and a moment within it that ended everything, both existing together without ever becoming the same, without ever resolving into something whole, remaining exactly as they are, fixed, divided, and forever tied to that single morning, when nothing could be undone and nothing could ever begin again. And over time, what becomes even more difficult to grasp is not only what happened, but how everything else continues as if that moment does not exist, how the world rebuilds itself around absence, how routines return, how days repeat, how people continue to believe in structure, in meaning, in order, even when somewhere within that same reality something has already proven that order can collapse completely without warning. Easter returns every year with the same quiet certainty, the same rituals, the same symbols carried from one generation to another, and for most people it remains untouched, unchanged, something stable they can return to, something that reassures them that there is a pattern to life, that even after darkness there is light, even after loss there is renewal, even after endings there is something that continues. But for me, that pattern no longer holds in the same way, because once you have seen something that does not follow it, once you have lived inside a moment where the expected transformation never comes, where the promise of renewal does not arrive, where the ending remains exactly as it is without shifting into something else, it becomes impossible to return to that belief in the same form. There is a difference between understanding an idea and experiencing something that contradicts it completely, and that difference cannot be undone, it cannot be ignored, it remains present in every reflection, in every attempt to reconnect with what once felt certain, because the experience does not disappear, it does not fade into something abstract, it remains concrete, fixed, undeniable. Even the passage of time, which people often rely on to soften memory, to create distance, to allow healing, does not function in the same way here, because time moves forward but the event does not, it remains where it was, unchanged, unaffected by the movement around it, creating a kind of dissonance between what continues and what remains fixed. There are days when it feels almost as if everything is divided into two layers, the visible one where life continues, where people speak, move, believe, and the hidden one where that moment still exists exactly as it did, unchanged, untouched, and both layers exist at the same time without merging, without resolving into a single experience that makes sense. I have wondered whether there is a point where something like this becomes part of the past in the way people expect, where it loses its immediacy, where it becomes something that can be looked at without feeling its full presence. But that point does not seem to exist, or if it does, it is not something I have reached, because the clarity of that day remains intact, as sharp as it was when it first unfolded. The idea of closure is something people often turn to, a belief that there is an end point where everything settles, where understanding replaces confusion, where acceptance replaces resistance. But closure suggests a completeness that does not exist here, because what happened does not conclude in a way that allows it to be placed somewhere separate, somewhere finished. It continues as part of everything that follows. Even the attempt to describe it, to place it into words, to construct a narrative that moves from beginning to end, feels incomplete, because the structure of a story implies progression, implies development, implies resolution, and this does not follow that structure. It begins long before it is visible and ends in a way that does not allow continuation in the usual sense, leaving behind something that does not fit into a conventional form. And still, people will continue to return to Easter, to speak about hope, about renewal, about the idea that something greater exists beyond what can be seen, and perhaps that is necessary. Perhaps that belief is what allows life to continue despite everything that contradicts it, because without it the weight of reality might be too much to carry. But alongside that belief, there will always exist moments that do not align with it, moments that remain separate, that do not transform, that do not evolve into something hopeful, and those moments do not disappear, they do not dissolve into the larger meaning, they remain as they are, distinct, permanent, beyond reinterpretation. And so the memory stays, not only as a recollection of what happened, but as a constant presence that exists alongside everything else, shaping perception, altering understanding, redefining what certain days mean, what certain symbols represent, what certain beliefs can hold, without ever fully replacing them, without ever fully merging with them. There is no final realization that changes everything, no moment where it all becomes clear, no understanding that resolves the contradiction, only the continued awareness that both realities exist at once, the one that people hold on to and the one that cannot be changed, both present, both real, both impossible to reconcile into a single, unified meaning. And that is where it remains, not as something that moves toward an ending, but as something that has already ended and continues to exist exactly as it was, tied to that day, tied to that moment, tied to everything that cannot be undone, existing without resolution, without transformation, without release, remaining exactly as it is, final, absolute, and forever beyond anything that could change it. At some point, even the repetition of memory begins to change, not in what it contains, but in how it is carried, because there is only so many times the mind can return to the same place with the same intensity before something shifts, not enough to remove it, not enough to soften it completely, but enough to alter the way it exists inside, turning something immediate into something constant, something that no longer arrives suddenly, but remains present at all times, quietly, persistently. There are no new details to discover, nothing hidden waiting to be uncovered. Everything that happened is already complete, already known, already fixed, and that completeness removes the possibility of change, because change requires something unfinished, something still in motion, and here everything has already reached its final form, leaving no space for alteration, no space for revision. Even the idea of understanding reaches a limit, a point where it no longer progresses, where additional thought does not lead to greater clarity, but simply circles back to the same place, the same realization that not everything can be fully explained, Not everything can be reduced to causes that feel sufficient. Not everything can be placed into a structure that makes it easier to accept. There is also a shift in how time is perceived, because when something remains so present, so unchanged, it disrupts the normal flow of past and present. It creates a kind of overlap where what happened then does not feel entirely separate from what exists now, where the distance between them becomes unclear, where memory and current awareness begin to exist in the same space. Easter continues to return, year after year, carrying with it the same message, the same symbols, the same belief in renewal, and each time it arrives, it brings with it that contrast again, that division between what the day represents and what it became in that moment, and that contrast does not weaken, it does not fade with repetition, it remains as sharp as it was the first time it was experienced. There are moments when I try to place myself back into the structure of that meaning, to see the day as it is seen by others, to reconnect with the idea of renewal, of something rising again, but the connection does not fully form, it remains incomplete, interrupted by the awareness of what also exists within that same day, something that does not follow that pattern, something that remains outside of it. It is not that the meaning disappears entirely, it is still there, still present, still recognized, but it exists alongside something else that does not belong to it, and the two do not merge, they remain separate, creating a kind of dual existence where both are real, both are present, but neither replaces the other. There is a tendency to believe that time eventually creates distance strong enough to allow separation, to allow something to become fully past, fully contained, but that does not seem to apply here, because containment requires boundaries, and this does not have clear boundaries, it extends into everything, into thought, into perception, into how other moments are experienced. Even silence changes over time, it becomes less overwhelming in its intensity, but more permanent in its presence, less sudden but more constant, no longer something that arrives, but something that remains, something that becomes part of the environment rather than something that interrupts it. And within that silence, there is no resolution waiting, no final understanding that will eventually arrive, no point where everything aligns into something that feels complete, only the continued existence of what has already been established, what has already reached its final form, what cannot be moved or reshaped. The idea of continuation takes on a different meaning in this context. It is not movement toward something new, not progression toward a different state, but simply the persistence of what already is, the extension of something that has already concluded into the time that follows it, without changing its structure, without losing its form. Easter remains what it is for the world, a symbol of life returning, of something beginning again after it has ended, and that meaning continues to exist unchanged for those who were not part of what happened, for those who can return to it without interruption, without contradiction. But alongside that meaning there will always be moments that do not follow it, moments that exist outside of it, moments that remain fixed in a way that does not allow transformation. And so both continue, the meaning and the contradiction, the belief and the reality, the idea of renewal and the presence of something that did not renew, both existing together without merging, without resolving, without becoming something unified, remaining separate, permanent, and unchanged. There is nothing beyond that, no hidden layer that alters it, no final realization that transforms it into something else, only the continued awareness of what is already there, what has already been defined, what cannot be undone, what cannot be rewritten, what remains exactly as it was, tied to that day, tied to that moment, tied to everything that ended without beginning again, existing without resolution, without change, without end. At the deepest level, beyond memory, beyond explanation, beyond even the attempt to understand, there remains something that cannot be translated into words, something that exists as a constant presence, not as a thought, not as an image, but as a state, something that does not come and go, something that does not depend on recalling, something that simply is. It is not loud, it does not demand attention, it does not force itself into every moment, but it never fully leaves either. It stays beneath everything, like a foundation that cannot be removed, like a layer that everything else rests on, even when it is not being consciously acknowledged. There are moments where life appears to move in a way that resembles normality, where time passes without interruption, where thoughts follow a structure that feels familiar. But even in those moments, there is an awareness that something fundamental has shifted, something that cannot be restored, something that separates what is now from what once was in a way that cannot be reversed. Easter, as a symbol, continues to exist in the world exactly as it always has, unchanged, untouched, carrying the same message it has carried for generations, and that continuity highlights the contrast even more, because it shows that meaning can remain intact even when reality does not follow it, even when events occur that stand completely outside of that meaning. There is something almost paradoxical in that, the idea that a day built on resurrection can coexist with something that represents absolute finality, that both can exist within the same space, within the same time, without influencing each other, without merging into something that resolves the contradiction. It raises a question that does not have a clear answer, whether meaning is something inherent, something that exists regardless of what happens within it, or whether it is something fragile, something that can be altered, distorted, or even broken by events that contradict it completely. From the outside, nothing has changed, the structure remains, the rituals continue, the words are the same, the beliefs are repeated, and yet from within, everything has changed, not in a way that is visible, not in a way that can be easily explained, but in a way that affects how everything is perceived, how everything is understood, how everything is connected. There is no resolution to that contradiction, no point where it aligns into something that feels complete, only the continued existence of both, the symbolic and the real, the expected and the actual, the meaning and its absence, each remaining in its own form, each unchanged by the presence of the other. And maybe that is the final truth that remains, not about what happened, not even about why it happened, but about the nature of reality itself, that it does not always align with the meanings people assign to it, that it can exist in ways that contradict those meanings without resolving them, without explaining them, without transforming them into something that feels complete. There is no ending that brings clarity, no final point that closes everything, no conclusion that transforms the event into something that can be fully understood, only the continuation of what already is, the persistence of something that has already reached its final form, remaining unchanged, remaining present, remaining beyond anything that could alter it. And so it remains there, fixed in that morning, within that day that was meant to represent life, within that moment that brought only an ending, both existing together without becoming one, both remaining separate, both remaining real, both remaining exactly as they are, without resolution, without transformation, without the possibility of ever becoming something else. And when everything that can be said has already been said, when every attempt to explain has reached its limit, what remains is not another answer, not another perspective, but a kind of still awareness that does not seek to resolve anything, that does not try to reshape what exists, that simply recognizes it as it is, without adding to it, without taking anything away. There is a point where even reflection becomes repetitive, where every path of thought leads back to the same place, the same understanding that nothing changes, that nothing shifts, that nothing evolves into something different, and at that point, thinking itself begins to lose its purpose, because there is no new ground to reach, no new clarity to uncover, only the repetition of what is already known. Easter continues, not as something that waits for interpretation, but as something that exists independently of it, something that carries its meaning regardless of what happens within it, and that independence is what creates the final separation, because it shows that meaning and reality do not depend on each other in the way people often believe they do. There is no reconciliation between them, no merging, no transformation that brings them into alignment, only coexistence, only the continued presence of both, each complete in its own form, each unaffected by the other, each remaining exactly as it is without change. Even the idea of an ending becomes uncertain, because endings suggest a conclusion, a point where something stops. But here nothing truly stops, it simply remains, it continues to exist in the same state, without progression, without alteration, without movement towards something else, creating a kind of permanence that does not rely on time. There is also a realization that not everything is meant to be resolved, that some things exist without offering closure, without offering understanding, without offering a final meaning that makes them complete, and that absence of resolution is not something that can be filled, it is something that must be accepted as part of what is. The structure of a story usually depends on movement, on change, on development, but this does not follow that structure, it exists outside of it. It begins before it is visible and ends without transforming into something else, leaving behind something that does not fit into the idea of a story at all, something that simply remains. And within that, there is a kind of stillness that does not change, that does not shift, that does not respond to time, a stillness that exists as the final state, not because it was chosen, not because it was intended, but because it is the result of something that cannot be reversed, cannot be undone, cannot be altered. Easter, as a symbol of renewal, continues to exist unchanged for the world, but within this moment, within this memory, renewal does not occur, it does not arrive, it does not transform what exists into something new, it remains absent, and that absence becomes part of the structure itself, something that defines it without needing to be stated. There are no more layers to uncover, no deeper meaning waiting beyond what has already been seen, only the continuation of what is already present, the persistence of something that has already reached its final form, existing without variation, without development, without the possibility of becoming something else. And so there is nothing left to add, nothing left to explain, nothing left to resolve, only the continued existence of what already is. Fixed in that moment, fixed in that day, fixed in a way that does not allow change, does not allow movement, does not allow transformation, remaining exactly as it was, final, complete, and beyond anything that could ever alter it. And even beyond that point where words begin to lose their meaning, where every sentence feels like a repetition of something already understood, there remains a quiet realization that nothing further is required, that not every story continues indefinitely, that some reach a state where continuation no longer adds anything, where extension does not deepen, where more words do not create more truth. There is a boundary that is not visible but can be felt, a point where everything that could be expressed has already taken form, where everything that could be examined has already been turned over, seen from every angle, returned to again and again until there is nothing new left to reveal, only the same structure, unchanged, complete in its final state. Easter remains what it is beyond all of this, untouched, unaffected, continuing in its cycle, repeating its meaning, holding its place in the world without interruption, and that continuity stands in contrast to what does not repeat, what does not cycle, what does not return, creating a distinction between what belongs to time and what exists outside of it. Because what happened does not repeat, it does not evolve, it does not return in a different form, it remains singular, fixed, absolute, something that exists once and then continues only as presence, not as progression, not as transformation, but as something that has already reached its end and simply remains there. There is no movement beyond that, no next stage waiting to be reached, no deeper level to descend into, only the continuation of existence alongside something that has already concluded, something that does not change as everything else continues to move around it. Even the idea of moving forward becomes something abstract, something that exists in contrast to what does not move, because while time progresses, while days pass, while life continues in its own structure, that moment remains exactly as it was, unaffected by the passing of time, unaffected by distance, unaffected by anything that would normally alter memory or experience. And in that contrast, there is nothing left to resolve, nothing left to question, nothing left to reinterpret, only the recognition that both realities exist, the one that moves and the one that remains still, the one that changes and the one that does not, both present, both real, both separate. There is no conclusion that unites them, no final understanding that brings them together into something coherent, only the continued existence of both in their own forms, without merging, without influencing each other, without altering each other. And at that point, continuation itself becomes unnecessary, because everything that could be carried forward has already been carried, everything that could be expressed has already been spoken, everything that could be understood has already reached its limit, leaving behind only what remains unchanged. So there is nothing beyond this, no hidden ending waiting to be revealed, no final statement that transforms everything into something new, only the quiet acceptance of what is already complete, already finished, already beyond anything that could be added to it. And in that stillness, there is no need for more, because nothing more can exist beyond what is already final, beyond what is already absolute, beyond what has already reached the point where continuation no longer changes anything, no longer adds anything, no longer becomes anything else.